Kulakevich, thank you very much for your time. After nearly 3.5 decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union, numerous post-Soviet countries continue to struggle with consolidating liberal democracy, rule of law, fundamental rights and freedoms. Many of these nations have experienced a recent trend towards populism, authoritarianism, and autocracy. What are the underlying and shared causes of these failures?
Well, I would start with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the definition of what Eastern Europe is. So some countries that are struggling with backsliding, the so-called, the going down towards the more like right-wing politics, is happening closer to the, the border of the European Union. And we are talking about the countries like Poland, Hungary, and a few others. So those are defined by United Nations as Eastern Europe. Some of these countries want to be called Central Europe, actually, but let's kind of 10 countries or close to the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe. Some are European Union, some are not at the moment. So for that reason, we need to talk and look at the collapse of the Soviet Union in the first place. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, former Soviet Republic and former Soviet bloc republics and the countries that were close to Soviet Union had high expectations for the collapse of the Soviet Union. But as we know, in the 90s, a lot of kleptocracy was going on, a lot of oligarchy stories in Russia, in Moldova, in Ukraine, same in the current European Union countries that were not in the European Union at that time. So after these countries joined the European Union, normally in the 2000s, the main idea was to reform economy, and some of this kleptocracy was put down, but less so after the membership actually occurred. And for that reason, that kind of, kleptocracy stayed in place. And that was a second disappointment for these countries and the people in these countries. The first one was the expectations of change after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The second one was after joining the European Union, that all the kleptocracy will go away. And then again, they were disappointing when the global crisis of 2008 happened. And they were kind of, okay, what this liberal democracy is bringing to us, and we need something else. And here we see populist leaders coming and promising different things, and people were receptive for those messages. So I would say disappointment in in changes historically just led slowly to this politics.
Right. We are witnessing a resurgence of populism in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, while Belarus solidifies its authoritarian rule under a one-man regime. What are the fundamental differences between the experiences of Eastern European countries and Belarus in terms of populism? Are there any notable similarities? How has the war in Ukraine impacted the consolidation of the authoritarian regime in Belarus?
Well, here we need to separate, because at the moment we historically we see the continuation and development in joining the European Union, and at the moment we have the following: we have European Union, we have Belarus and Moldova and Ukraine who are EU candidates at the moment. So we should not compare European Union and post-Soviet republics who are not in the European Union at the moment. So the process is very different. While we see the decline in the values in the European Union, they are still democracies. Even though, and that's another kind of, point, is that democracy is not one word does not encompass all countries. There are different rankings for democracy. Some countries are more democratic, some are less democratic. But European Union countries, even though they are declining, they are democratic. And when we talk Belarus, in this case, it is an authoritarian regime which is strengthening these days after the crackdown in 2020 protests, the biggest protests in the history of Belarus. And what we see right now is kind of going towards sultanism. That's what I would say. Some people
Sultanism.
Sultanism, like sultan, yes. So meaning the power of one person. And some people call the regime in Belarus these days new totalitarian. And I would say that I would not call it new totalitarian because there is no ideology in the country, and totalitarian regime requires ideology and mobilization of people. Belarus doesn't have that. Belarus has politics surrounded around, I mean, how it's called, surrounded, I'm sorry, kind of going around one person, which is a sultan, and sultanism does not require ideology. It's kind of arbitrary use of power in any way. That's what was going on in Belarus. It's stronger, I mean, worse than just calling it authoritarian regime, but not totalitarian really, because it doesn't mean all the aspects. And to the point that Belarusian regime, how the war in Ukraine, you know, the full-scale invasion, let's say, because the war started in 2014, and the full-scale invasion began in 2022. So I would say the regime started leaning towards sultanism after the protest of 2020. And when the balancing act of Lukashenko was not possible because the door to the European Union was closed by the opposition figures, he didn't have a choice but to support his ally Vladimir Putin, who knew that Lukashenko doesn't have a choice and he wants to maintain the power. Let's use him. Why not? He will say nothing if we bring the army to the Belarusian territory and shoot missiles from the Belarusian territory. And from 2020, the crackdown has been ongoing. And I would say, you know, worsening, maybe even worsening these days. But it has not started in 2022. It started in 2020.
All right. Given the erosion of the so-called pillars of Lukashenko's populism, his alleged proximity to the people, his self-portrayal as a guarantor of peace, and promise of economic and political stability, what internal and external factors contributed to this erosion?
I would say the erosion of the populist regime of Lukashenko happened again after 2020, because that's what ruined his story. Guarantor of stability. He received a lot of sanctions after 2020, and the war brought more sanctions together with Russia. So that's stability, I mean, because we're talking economic stability. So proximity to people was ruined after he spilled blood by suppressing the protests in 2020, which were brutal, and the United Nations has records of you know, rape with batons and the deaths of some participants, a lot of political prisoners these days, almost 1,500. He's not longer a guarantor of peace, even though the peace in Belarus is you see it. So Belarus the government did not send its army to Ukraine, but that's because the government cannot afford to send it. Lukashenko needs to keep on these forces to stay in power. So I would say two pillars were ruined after 2020, the stability and the proximity to people, because people were disappointed. And the guarantor of peace no longer after the war, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, because he allowed the missiles to be shot from the Belarusian territory. So he is a co-aggressor in the war.
All right. In your presentation at an ECPS panel last year, you noted that Lukashenko's success in creating an image of the political elite as working for the people. How has this perception evolved among Belarusian citizens, particularly in the light of COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine, which brought about economic and security challenges?
So I would say that people saw the real face of the Lukashenko regime, that people kind of, were disappointed and realized that the regime has been lying to them in many aspects. For example, the story of when people were kind of wearing white bracelets during the presidential election in 2020, while voting for the next president, they could observe people around them, how many people were wearing the white bracelets at the polling stations. And when Lukashenko claimed 80% and gave Svetlana Tikhanovskaya 10%, that was a lot of percentage grabbed by Lukashenko. And sometimes I'm thinking he should have claimed 60. He would have. It's possible he could have avoided all this story, but I mean, not defending the regime, just teasing and kind of evaluating, analyzing. But that's when people saw that the regime is lying, really, and when they started going and protesting. Before the crackdown began, this brutal stuff, they saw each other. They saw the symbols that are not associated with the official flag, red and green. They embraced the colors of historic colors of opposition, white, red, white. And in this way, they started associating themselves in a new imagined community, different from the one the official regime is associated with, which is kind of, bloody and red and green. So in this regard, you cannot unsee it because people felt it, and you need to kind of basically lose memory. And people do not lose memory. They know that this happened. The thing is that these days, the regime has been silencing all possible dissent. Civil society has been killed. Nothing independent is going on in Belarus, and everybody who is stayed inside the country, who are against the regime, they are living in fear, because the regime can just put in prison for liking some kind of dissent on social media even, or having something on the phone. They're intercepting people on the border, and everybody's aware. And but cannot do anything because these are consequences. People know that there will be consequences.
Right. You argue that Russia unofficially controls Belarus, which has significantly influenced Lukashenko's alignment with Putin's interests. Could you elaborate on how this control manifests in Belarusian governance and decision-making processes, particularly in matters concerning pro-Putin foreign policy and military cooperation with Russia?
Well, in this sense, we need to kind of, remember about the definition what sovereignty is. Sovereignty is defined in political science is the monopoly of violence or within a specific borders. And Lukashenko doesn't have complete sovereignty all over the country, meaning he doesn't have monopoly of violence. By violence, we don't mean crime or anything. We mean police, army controlling the territory, having order, maintaining order within the borders. So if you look at Ukraine doesn't have sovereignty, complete sovereignty, because the Russian forces are on Ukrainian territory. Similar situation is happening in Belarus, but in a different aspect. So while Ukrainians are paying for their sovereignty with blood, Belarusian sovereignty has been challenged, how do you call it, peacefully, by moving the forces, Russian forces on the Belarusian territory. So the trainings are happening, and I hear that, Russian we kind of say military officers have been in control of some army, let's say in control of some army, let's do that. And the other thing is that shows that Belarusian sovereignty is challenged is by having nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons on the Belarusian territory. And these nuclear weapons do not belong to Belarus. they belong to Russia, and Russia controls these weapons. And that means the monopoly of violence within specific territory is challenged. So for that reason, it's important to kind of remember that Belarus is also under threat, that people of Belarus are not associated with the Belarusian regime. And while the war is happening on the Ukrainian territory, Belarus is also under kind of, this threat, losing its own sovereignty quietly or kind of, slowly at the same time.
Right. In your article, Anti-Authoritarian Learning, Prospects for Democratization in Belarus, based on a study of Polish solidarity, you explore the anti-Lukashenko protest movement in Belarus through a comparative lens with solidarity movement in Poland. Why do you believe the anti-Lukashenko democracy movement has not achieved success comparable to the solidarity movement in Poland? What are the primary differences and similarities between the two movements?
So I would say, and in this article, we discuss 4 cycles, 4 stages, how social movements succeed or finish. So Belarus did not achieve bureaucratization of the movement. So the movement should start, people should see each other, so it starts, then people see each other, then the movement bureaucratizes, and the number 4 is how it ends, succeeds or not. So I would say in Belarus, we had first stage and second stage. So it started, people saw each other, 500,000 people were protesting during the weekends. That's a lot of people. So they realize that they are not alone, that the change is needed, right? But number 3 is bureaucratization. Bureaucratization is the leadership of the movement. So people cannot lead themselves for a long time. There should be some kind of, leadership that's commanding the movement, helps the people to organize. So this bureaucratization in Belarus, first of all, happened outside the country, which is difficult because Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was forced outside the country. In Poland, bureaucratization happened inside the country. And it took some time to organize, while the regime was suppressing the protests at the same time. So here we kind of, I wouldn't say necessarily that the protests and the process has ended, because bureaucratization did happen, even though outside the country, and it never went anywhere. It exists. And we need to remember that for Polish solidarity, it took 8 years and even longer to achieve success. It began in the 80s and it was going on till almost the collapse of the Soviet Union. So let's kind of, have a hope that this kind of part of solidarity movement in Poland, which was happening underground at one point, is happening a little bit in Belarus. And kind of, I would say it's better to look at the processes positively, considering the movement exists, the leadership exists. So what Belarusian people and, opposition is waiting is for a window of opportunity. And if the window of opportunity opens, there is a force that can replace the current regime in Belarus.
All right. In the same article, you assert that the 2020 presidential election generated the largest protest in the history of independent Belarus. Masses of Belarusian citizens took to the streets to protest what they considered to be a corrupt and fraudulent election. However, in the recent elections on February 25, characterized by the Council of Europe as a travesty of democracy, there were not many public demonstrations. Why do you think the Belarusians didn't mobilize to protest the fraudulent elections this time around? Has the demand for change in Belarus been killed by systematic repression and violence? Or how do you assess the state of resilience and determination of the protest movement in the face of such adversity?
Well, in this case, we are talking about parliamentary election on February 25. So parliamentary election and presidential election in Belarus are 2 different beasts. So parliamentary elections in Belarus almost never generated any resilience or resent or dissent or protests. So we are talking about like 10, 15 people, I mean, very, very small amount of resentment and sometimes none. So it's not surprising that we were not observing anything in Belarus for that specific election. Again, historically, and these parliamentary elections are people are appointed by the regime very often, and the candidates are almost never succeed to I mean, opposition candidates almost never succeed to be elected. It's very, very rare. It happened, but it's very rare. And people do not believe in how to say it, positive change or fact to go and protest. And another reason is that, well, we should not forget that there is so much fear in the country these days. And even if you want to, you question yourself, should I do it and go to prison, or maybe, you know, there will be another opportunity, because again, historically, this is not the one. This is not that critical juncture. This is not that opportunity. So we will be talking more about more realistic dissent when we will be talking about next presidential election, and we already hear that this parliamentary election on February 25, Lukashenko said that he is gonna run. So, but that one we can discuss kind of about the protest, not this one.
All right. What is the significance of parliamentary and local elections held on February 25 in Belarus? What do the elections tell us about the nature of the regime in the country?
Yeah, this one is, as I mentioned, they are not historically. They are not generating any dissent or resentment because the country has not. People do not see any opportunity for change for that. And again, the fear in the country dictates less protests for the parliamentary election, and kind of proves one more time that people don't see an opportunity of change at the moment, that Lukashenko is holding on power as much as he can, and cracking down on any dissent, any signs.
Right. What role does Putin's Russia play in the consolidation of Lukashenko's regime and the suppression of popular dissent? How has this suppression in Belarus affected the support for Russia's actions in Ukraine?
Well, here is we need to kind of talk a little bit again about 2020. When before 2020, Lukashenko's regime was known for balancing act. The balancing act means that he was, if Putin is not, says something that doesn't give money, for example, or says something that Lukashenko doesn't like, he goes to the European Union and asks money there by promising to release political prisoners in exchange for finances, because he always had political prisoners. He releases one or two, says, listen, let me just release a few guys, give me money. And guess what? They were giving him supported money. They were sowing the relationships, and so it worked for decades. But after 2020, when Svetlana Tikhanovskaya left and went to the European Union, she's in Lithuania these days, she is lobbying the European Union leaders, the United States leaders, and basically closed the door to the balancing act for Lukashenko. So he has only Putin on his side, on the other side. We are not talking China. China is another kind of story here. But let's look at Russia. So when the protest began in 2020, we could observe 2 weeks of inaction by the Lukashenko regime. There was nothing going on. People were peacefully protesting, and a lot of people were coming out. And Lukashenko's regime was confused, looks like it. He was running with a rifle. He was not making any moves. for 2 weeks. And then suddenly, you know, if you look at the graph, there was like this, no beatings, nothing's going on. And suddenly after 2 weeks, the crackdown began like this. The graph looks like this. And why? The question is why? Because he gained confidence. How he gained confidence? Because Putin promised money, promised support to kind of, you know, to put that crackdown on these protests. So basically, you know, if you imagine, like, listen, my dear friend Alexander, like you need to kill it now. It's 2 weeks is enough. So basically, the regime gained the confidence and put at the end of to these protests, and from that on, Lukashenko only has Putin. And to stay in power, to hold on to it, he has been trading sovereignty in exchange of kind of staying in power, because it doesn't make sense for Putin to change Lukashenko because he's in his pocket anyway. So he is using him. He used his for the territory. He to launch the missiles. He put the nuclear weapons on the Belarusian territory. But Lukashenko said, again, he holds on to power at this moment. So while Putin is in power, Lukashenko knows that he needs to listen, but he has his own, how to call it, realm of rule, like, you know, land, even if it's not a monopoly, but he is the guy.
Right. The next question is, Belarus' strategic significance for Russia in the context of the Ukraine war is underscored by its border with Ukraine and its role as a staging ground for Russian military operations. Considering this, what are the potential long-term implications of Belarus' cooperation with Russia on regional security dynamics and the broader geopolitical landscape in Eastern Europe?
In this case, I would say Belarus will stay in the same situation as it is right now, and all hopes are for the victory of Ukraine. If Ukraine kind of, you know, ends up having a frozen conflict or kind of some kind of peace agreement, I don't think they want or will be willing to voluntarily go for the peace agreement. If there's going to be some kind of peace agreement, they're going to be imposed. So all hopes are on the United States to send the foreign aid and financial aid to Ukraine. So basically, Belarus will get any new window of opportunity for change of the current situation if Ukraine wins and some changes happen in the Russian government. Then Belarusian opposition forces might have some kind of chance to change the current situation. Other than that, it doesn't look like any changes are happening, because Lukashenko has Russia's support, and his crackdown on all dissent has been ongoing, and in some cases, some people will say even increasing. People are dying in prisons of Belarus, and I don't see any prospect at this time, unfortunately.
Right. The presence of Russian troops in Transnistria presents a significant obstacle to Moldova's territorial control, a crucial condition for EU membership. How do you foresee Moldova addressing this issue as part of its EU accession process?
Well, in this case, kind of, you know, Moldova was the lucky one. So while Belarusian sovereignty has been challenged, Ukraine is fighting with blood for its own sovereignty. Moldova would have been, you know, the next target if Russian forces had been kind of reaching Transnistria, but it was lucky because there is no army in Moldova kind of you know, strong to resist. But at the moment, so they got the EU candidacy together with Ukraine, and the hope in Moldova is to join the European Union together with Transnistria. So even though the forces of Russian military is stationed in Moldova, but it's still very important to look at the context. This after 2014, if we go back a little bit, yes. So let's do even before 2014, before Russia started showing its true face to Ukraine. There was a very gray zone on the border with Transnistria and Ukraine. So there was armed trade, lots of smuggling, and you name it. So after 2014, Ukraine started controlling its border because they saw that, well, Russia looks like Russia is an enemy, actually. Yes, and Transnistria has Russian soldiers. So they started controlling the border with Transnistria, and it started harder to move to Transnistria through Ukraine, because, like, why would we let the enemy to move through our territory, right? And Moldova itself, in the capital, started controlling all these Russian soldiers, also going to officially, Transnistria is officially Moldovan territory. So Russian soldiers flying to Moldova's airport are being watched. Why would we allow more new soldiers go into our territory, even if it's Transnistria and where they are located since 1992? Yes. So it has been harder to get through to Transnistria for Russian officers. So, and because this frozen conflict in Transnistria is kind of began and kind of lasts since the 90s, the beginning, 1992, yes, then this older, original Russian soldiers are no longer. Those are already children of those officers, those Russian army. And these new people are not necessarily from Russia, all of them. Many of them are from Transnistria. Their home is Transnistria. Their home is not Russia, it is Transnistria. So that's why, when you were born here, that's your land, not that where your parents came from. So they have different loyalty. So their loyalty is kind of for Russia, but it's for your own land. So this one is kind of complicates and helps Moldova, I would say, in a sense that they might be considering what's better for us, for Transnistria, not for Russia. So Transnistria is these benefits from Russia with retirement money and with free gas, right? So that's good for them. At the same time, Moldova has European Union trade agreements with EU countries, so they're trading through Romania, which supports very greatly Moldova because they're culturally very close. So Transnistria benefits from the trade agreements of Moldova with the European Union more and more. So they are kind of in between, benefiting from Russia and from Moldova being kind of closer to the European Union. Here, that's why we are talking about Moldova having expectations to join with Transnistria, even though that's kind of, difficult and complicated task, because Russia is not giving up its hopes for kind of, disturbing Transnistria and disturbing Moldova, let's say, through Transnistria.
And lastly, today, the funeral for Alexei Navalny was held in Moscow, who was killed in a Russian prison 2 weeks ago, almost 2 weeks ago. Does it say anything for the dissidents in Belarus?
Yes, we should remember that's the first thing Belarusian forces are thinking after the death of Navalny. Started thinking there are so many political prisoners in Belarus from whom Belarusian relatives and opposition and the world haven't heard for almost a year, or maybe sometimes a year, and we don't know their fates moment, and that's scary. And we are talking about more people than just one person. Navalny is big name for Russia. In Belarus, we have several names like that, and we don't know the fate at the moment. And basically, for Belarus specifically, Navalny is kind of highlighting the situation with the Belarusian situation, the Belarusian political prisoners, I would say, how bad it is in Belarus, which is not bad, I would say, to highlight it and draw attention, because at some point, Ukrainian war, shadows a little bit Belarus, and it's kind of because it's smaller and it's not paying with blood, but it's paying with freedoms of these people. And a few days ago, we heard about the death of another political prisoner. His name was kind of not like Tikhanovsky or Babarika, a little bit lower name, but he died, and there are already 5 people who died in prisons in Belarus. So yes, this is. We look at the death of Navalny, which honestly, for me personally, was not that surprising, because the regime tried to kill him at one point already. So they finished the job, even if it's kind of may feel or seem as lacking emotions, but that's strategic. Same as they killed Prigozhin, because traitors die. That's how it works. So, but at the same time, yes, that's for Russia. Belarus has its own story, and it's not that bright, especially with political prisoners, that the information is missing at the moment. Yes.
Professor Kulakevich, thank you so very much. I appreciate your time.
It is my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. All the best.
Yes, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.